Everybody ready? Ready?
Yeah.
All right, listen.
It's your weekend show.
Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
With Bob Biermann.
It's great.
And welcome to your weekend show. I'm your host, Bob Biermann. I'm so glad you're taking some time from your busy weekend schedule to spend it with me. Today in the program, I want to share some thoughts about this digital world in which we live and also the analog people we truly are. I'll get to that in just a few moments. To start the program today, I would like to thank those that are reporting back, hearing the program on the frequency of 9395 kilohertz, which is WRMI, one of their frequencies from Okeechobee, Florida. Also heard this past week from Germany, someone listening on 15770 kilohertz, and we are so excited to be heard in Germany again, as at this time of the year the propagation is so much better. That also from WRMI. I also know that each week people are listening to The Voice of Hope out of Zambia, Africa, in the eastern part of the continent, and that signal with two different frequencies covers into South Africa, into West Africa, and even into North Africa and Europe. And so we're excited for all the opportunity that we have with the Voice of Hope broadcasting in Zambia. And of course, domestic radio here in the United States, we are thankful, would love to hear from you as well, and those that do take the time to listen each weekend somehow when their time fits online. You can find out more about the show at yourweekendshow.com. That's yourweekendshow.com. And we are also found on Facebook, and there you can find us at Your Weekend Show. Make that one word, Your Weekend Show. Search for us on Facebook. And if you get a chance this week, visit the Facebook page and even like us if you like the page. It would mean so much to me as we do this program each week. This program is about sharing about life, the life you and I go through together. I was thinking the other day, all the things that I've seen in my lifetime. And I'm in my early 60s, so I'm not all that old, at least I try to tell myself that. But I have seen advances in my lifetime that generations before me never saw. I think of my father's time on this earth, and he went from being born at the beginning of radio and died as the computer age was really taking hold. He saw so much in a lifetime. And in just the years that he has been gone, about 14 years now, so much more has happened and developed in our technology. The flat screen television, just to name one that is now a staple in most Western homes. These large screen, flat screen, high definition televisions. I can remember what it was like to get our first color TV back in the late 1960s. And it seemed such a huge advance from the smaller black and white TV set that I remembered from my childhood. And how television remained relatively unchanged for decades until the screen started getting larger, and then ultimately the advent of high-definition television. When I was a child, I remember looking at the newspaper on a Sunday morning. And in the newspaper, if you remember, if you are in the United States or Canada, there was a cartoon strip called Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy was a police detective, but he had all these high-tech that would blow your mind kind of gadgets. And I can remember he had this little wristwatch that actually had a television screen, and that was his two-way wristwatch TV radio. And it seemed such an impossible thing at that time to have a television made as compact as a wristwatch. Even when I started in electronics in the 1970s and into the 80s, the idea of a miniaturized television was still something that was not on the radar screen. We were still looking at pretty large TV sets, pretty large cathode ray tube, CRTs, which most computers until about 10 years ago had. And now we've gone to the flat screen. A few years ago, Apple came out with the Apple Watch, which has a TV display in the size of a watch. And there's even a Google version of the same thing running on Android. We have come a long way in miniaturizing all of our electronics. And trust me, as a person that lived his life in technology, it excites me, and I have many of these high-tech devices around me and in my home. Yeah, I have satellite TV, I have high-speed internet, I have satellite radio in my car. I listen to things online. I use a tablet. I use a smartphone. I use computers and servers. This is what I do in part of my work, week in and week out. I find entertainment value and I find work value within those devices to be more efficient. I even use a computer to record and edit this particular radio program each week. So I am not anti-technology at all. I just believe in making smart use of our time and the gifts of our technology. A few weeks ago, I reminded you of the statement that is attributed to Einstein. Whether he actually said it or not, there's some debate, but it wouldn't surprise me as he talked about the day that our machines begin to rule us instead of us ruling the machine. That's been a fear of technology since the beginning of the high-tech revolution with radio in the 1920s. People wondered how much good can come from sitting around listening to a radio for your entertainment, and then with the advent of television, even additional concerns of how we utilize our time. I think back to when I was in my 20s and 30s, a newlywed husband with a family, and we had a family TV. We didn't have TVs in every room. We had a family TV. And for a while each evening, we would watch television programs, but we still engaged in conversation, particularly during the commercials. We didn't have ways like TiVo or some of the satellite technology or cable to bypass commercials. You had to endure. And so that became a time where you chatted and talked. I remember I used to read newspapers at one time. Now I read all my news online. Life has changed significantly with the advent of technology. Number one, with a newspaper, you had to write the story, edit the story, then put it into typeset and print and get the newspaper delivered. And by the time you got the newspaper, the story you're reading was hours old. Now, with 24/7 news is virtually instantaneous and oftentimes covered live. Technology is a good thing, but technology can also be, well, I don't want to use the word, but I'll use it anyway. It can be a dangerous thing when we let it rule our lives. I remember way back around 2005, a good friend of mine was talking about the kind of ministry work that I do and said, you could build a virtual church online. And I thought about it, and over the years I've thought about it often, and it's something I really don't want to do per se. I don't really want to build an online church, though I don't mind using online technology to take a service and share it outside of the four walls to those that can't get here, those that may be traveling or away. But do I want to be the pastor of strictly an online church? No, not really. I'm always reminded of what the writer of Hebrews says, forsaking not the assembling of thyself together, which is the manner of some. I think there's something very important about like-minded Christians gathering together at their house of worship at least one time a week to share in person on a human level, one with another. The church is not a virtual world, it's the real world. And maybe that's my resistance, because I do still appreciate the real world. Yet my fear with many of the young people today who have been raised with this technology as second nature, how many parents have decided that to keep peace in the household, they let their children go to their rooms and watch their TVs and play with their devices and never really pay a whole lot of attention to the content and the things that they're engaging themselves in this virtual and not real world. I look at young people today that may go to a bowling alley or a restaurant, and they don't even talk to each other. They're so busy with their faces in their devices, living in their virtual world and being who they want to be on Facebook by sharing carefully the things they want you to know. And it's so lacking anything of interpersonal depth. Yeah, the online world has its place, but it's not the real world. And that is my concern. Do you find yourself living more in a virtual world, disengaged from the real world, except when you have to be? What kind of a real life is that? Another story I read earlier this week, maybe it was the latter part of last week, I can't quite remember. Somebody, I believe, from Apple was talking about how technology is advanced and it continues to advance, and their predictions of artificial intelligence, the merging of the human and the machine, could occur by the year 2030, maybe 2037 at the latest. That may seem on the surface a long way away. We're talking 13 to 17 years from now. Will our technology outgrow our ability to remain a human being? I think of some people that can hear this program today that live in parts of the world where they do not have all the advances in technology, though the desire to have the smartphone and the computers and the tablets are there, but the online connected access is limited. I even read a story a couple of days ago that even in places like Cuba, they're beginning to allow online access in private homes without having to have any kind of a special permit or license, and they're beginning to try to sell being online as Cuba tries desperately to enter the 21st century world, having literally lived in the late 1950s for the past 60 years. We do live in a changing world. We've talked about this before, how many organizations, including Christian ministries, and I can think of many of them, not just one or two, but many, that have abandoned their traditional methodologies to adapt to this virtual world of video and apps and online content, believing that is the way to reach the world. Yeah, it may reach half, but not all. And I'm also concerned for those that take that direction of the peril you may end up putting yourself in when you have put all of your eggs into this online basket. The one thing we sometimes forget, in times of disaster, in times of warfare, the internet can be filtered, controlled, and even shut off in the blink of an eye. And if you are a ministry 100% dependent upon the internet, at any given moment, in any given location around the world, and perhaps even because of your content in the United States, you may find your message blocked. That's one reason that I still love being on shortwave with this program. Yeah, the program is online, and I can imagine that in some countries like Pakistan, for example, well, definitely North Korea and China, that you may not be able to hear your weekend show or even read about us online. But the power of a shortwave signal crosses international borders and can reach the places that can be easily shut off by conventional terrestrial radio, AM and FM, and also completely blocked by government using online internet services. I will embrace and continue to use new technology for this program. I will continue to use, embrace, and develop other avenues for online. But in the process, there are two things I am not going to abandon under any circumstances. The use of international shortwave to reach those places that cannot be reached by conventional means. And also, in terms of my church, my services may end up being online, but the church will not simply live online. We will not forsake the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some. We'll talk more about this world we live in, the dangers of the online world, and we will talk more about the things we struggle with day in and day out here on your weekend show. Once again, you're listening to your weekend show, heard on WRMI on multiple frequencies in the weekend, and the Voice of Hope out of Zambia, Africa, domestic radio and online. And you can find us at yourweekendshow.com. That's yourweekendshow.com. Or even find us on Facebook. Look for Your Weekend Show. We use all that we have before us to share this message. And I truly hope that you find each week this message and this program beneficial to you and your life.
Come gather round people wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you'd better start swimming, or you'll sink like a stone. 'Cause the times, they are a-changing. Come writers, come critics, you who prophesy with your pen, keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin. And there's no telling who it is naming, for the loser now will be later to win. 'Cause the times, they are a-changing. Come mothers, come fathers throughout the land, don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging, so please get out of the new one if you can't lend a hand. 'Cause the times, they are a-changing. Come senators, come congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall. For he who gets hurt will be he who has stalled. There's a battle outside and it's raging. It'll soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, 'cause the times, they are a-changing. The line, it is drawn, the course, it is cast. The slow one now will later be fast, as the present now will later be past. The order is rapidly fading, and the first one now will later be last, for the times, they are a-changing. For the times, they are a-changing.
And welcome back to your weekend show. I'm your host, Bob Biermann. I'm so glad you're with us this weekend. As that song was playing, I was thinking back in time to when I was a much younger person, not even quite in my teens at that time, and I was thinking what my life was like back then, the things that I did compared to so much of what kids at that age do today, and how the dynamics have shifted so dramatically in a period of 45, 50 years. Half century, it's hard to believe. A half a century has gone by. When I was a young child, I was born and raised in the metropolitan New York City area. As a child, I lived on Long Island. By the time I was around 11 or 12, I was taking the train, the Long Island Railroad, into New York City on a Saturday. Even knew how to get around on the subway. Back in those days, we spent a lot of our time outdoors. We didn't watch that much television, may listen to radio in the evening, may even watch some TV programs. We spent a lot of our time exploring the world around us, not living in a virtual world. About the time that I was turning 13, we moved from Long Island to a small town way in the upstate of New York. A small community of just a handful of thousands of people in a very agricultural-oriented region of New York State, not far from Lake Ontario. And I would spend a lot of my time walking to see my friends, and who knows how many miles I walked during my youth. Today, so many young people come home and they plop themselves down in a chair, a couch, or a bed, and they're ingrained and just consumed by a device, and they no longer go outside and experience the real world. I can remember when I would have time to, let's say, play with something electronic. In my case, it was a stereo system. And I had a pair of headphones. And I enjoyed listening to all types of music on recorded records. And I was thinking about the kind of music that was in style in the late 60s and into the early part of the 1970s. Many of the songs had kind of a gloomy message in the 1960s. It was a very, very tumultuous time in the United States and Canada and even in Europe. Back in those days, the Cold War between the former Soviet Union and the Western world, Western Europe, the United States, was still in full swing. So much of Eastern Europe we can travel to freely now was under the control of the Soviet Union. People in East Germany couldn't travel to the West, and Berlin was surrounded by a wall. Times were so different. People were predicting the end of time, the end of the age, and even the secular music of the day reflected some of that gloom and doom. One song comes to mind from the middle 1960s. We're on the eve of destruction. It was a scary time in its own right. As a child, I can remember people building fallout shelters in case a nuclear bomb was to be dropped on a city like New York. How would we survive? It was truly a different time. The Vietnam War consumed the hearts and minds of so many people during the 1960s and right into the early part of the 1970s. Young people being drafted and going to war in Far East Asia. There were riots, there were protests in the streets and on college campuses about the war and racial equality. Yet it was still a good time, in spite of all the difficulties we faced during that time. The music was a reflection of that time, and I remember one song that came to mind the other day as I was driving to work. Goes way back. I used to, as I said, I'd be in my bedroom some evenings, and after the homework was done and I'm in for the night, I remember putting a record on and putting my headphones on. It was a Jimi Hendrix song, of all things, and it was called 1983, A Mermaid I Will Be. And it had this very apocalyptic message of destruction and war and death. Many of us at that time, especially those that read the book The Late Great Planet Earth, felt that by the 1980s, it would all come to a crashing end. We couldn't see a positive future at times, though we lived day to day, making the best of the life that we had. By the latter part of the 1970s, the fear of the 1980s kind of drifted away. And instead, the 1980s became a time of profound change again. The introduction of the personal computer started in the 1980s. It wasn't mainstream, but a handful of people, myself included, began to dabble with these new and very expensive devices and trying to find a practical application for business and work, and perhaps even at home. My, how the 1990s changed all that. And the computer went from being a luxury to almost a necessity. And even grandparents got online using things like America Online and other venues. I can remember browsers like Netscape that are no longer around as we first had our peek at the World Wide Web. In the 1990s, I never would have believed for a moment how much of our lives would be contained in a little box. How much of our life would move into a cloud. Our personal data, our banking, our information, our pictures, our memories, contained in this virtual environment. When I was young, I was out exploring and learning the world around me. Today, people learn about their world on a device, but oftentimes it's only a picture, it's only a video. You miss all the nuances of a real, personal, real-life encounter with nature. A real, personal, real encounter, even with education. Now, there's nothing wrong with getting advanced education online because sometimes that's just the only way you can do it. But I think some of the greatest memories I have from my education experience after high school was being on a campus, being with people, interacting with humankind, not simply a machine. The biggest problem as I see it today in this world, it's not the technology. It's not the advancements. It's the fact we're allowing this technology to run our lives, to dominate our lives, to become our life. At what point do we cease being people and just become an element in a virtual world? Like I say, there's a big world around us, and so many of us are missing that world because of our, do I dare use the word, addiction to our online platforms? Look, I'm as guilty as many in my age bracket in my use of Facebook. In recent months, I've turned off many of the notifications on my phone so I'm not disturbed. It gets to a point that you're having a conversation and your phone beeps or makes a buzz or a sound or a vibration. You got to check out. Somebody just posted something on Facebook, or maybe I'm missing some great email, which 9 times out of 10 is spam mail trying to advertise something, and it's not all that important. But as long as we leave everything turned on our devices, it interferes with our personal human life. That's the point that I'm trying so desperately to drive home today. And maybe I'm not finding the right words. I'm trying to. How do you find that balance of using technology? And believe me, I use it every day and I continue to find new ways to use it. But I'm also trying to find that balance so desperately where it no longer becomes all-consuming. There are people that have to have their devices beeping all the time. They can't miss that new post on Facebook. They don't want to miss that message. They don't want to miss that phone call. We become so connected to our work, we're no longer connected at home. That, to me, is the ultimate danger of the online life. And I fear for this young generation where parents, for simplicity and lack of confrontation, just allow their children to sneak off to their bedrooms by the hour. Not for just an hour or two, but for hours on end, playing video games, looking at things online, living in a virtual world, and never interacting even any longer with their own families. The one thing I treasure from my upbringing that is so rapidly getting lost, I mean rapidly getting lost in so many homes, was dinner around the family table. We would gather as a family. My brother, my sister, my father, my mother, the 5 of us would gather at a table. We would say grace. We would enjoy conversation and learn about the other individual's day. In many households, that is lost. Now they come out of the bedroom and come to the kitchen, grab their plate, and hide back in their rooms. Rather than have confrontation on a Sunday morning, we stop going to church. It's just easier and lazier not to. After all, we spend our time with our television and our devices. We look at everybody else's life and fail to take the time to live our own life. Those are the great dangers of living in a virtual and non-realistic world. The media gives us false hope and expectations, and oftentimes false information and even false news. There are people that look at these sites, look at Facebook and see a story of interest, and they believe it to be true because it fits their ideology, when oftentimes it's nothing more than what we call clickbait. so you can be bombarded with an advertisement. And we have young people today that are not wise enough to discern the difference because they have lived the majority of their life in this fake and phony world that's not real. They haven't learned to master life. They've allowed the device to master them. I think of the church that I attend. We recently had a congregational meeting, our annual meeting, and trying to look at the future on what it is we can do. Now, will I use this technology that's out there to bring the message of hope of this church to the outside virtual world? Of course I will. I'm not foolish enough to think that simply opening up the church doors on a Sunday or maybe a Saturday or a Wednesday is sufficient because no one's going to know you're there. I'll use the technology to get the word out, but I want to encourage people to, just for a while, leave that fake and phony virtual world and come to where the real world reaches eternity, in a place where fellow believers congregate. The other problem with the virtual world, as I see it, people can easily hide behind a persona. They can be hurting so deep inside, facing challenges that you and I could never imagine. Yet they put the smiley face up and how exciting their life is today. Even in their own personal life, they simply dwell on one aspect that they share, and that becomes their world. The internet has been a great way to expand your horizons, but it's also been a great way to destroy your life. I'm sure some of you listening to me right now can probably share stories from your own personal life or people you know and love whose lives were destroyed, their families broken apart because of content online. We have got to become the masters of who we are and decide what is important. Is reality important, or do we want to just hide in this fake and phony world and miss so much of the joys of life? Yeah, life has got its shares of its ups and downs. It's got its difficulties. It's got its challenges. It's got its losses. It's got sorrow. It's got grief. It's got all the bad things, but it also, if you allow it, is so full of rich and deep things that far exceed anything found in a fake, phony, and virtual world. I pray today that somehow, if you are spending the majority of your life in a virtual world, you'll take your face out of that tablet or your phone and for once take a real look at yourself and the life around you are missing. Life is an experience to be had. Don't miss it.
There are places I remember all my life, though some have changed, some forever, not for better. Some are gone and some remain. All these places had their meanings. With lovers and friends I still can recall. Some are dead and some are living. In my life I've loved them all. But of all these friends and lovers, there is no one compared and these memories lose their meaning when I think of love as something new. Though I know I'll never lose affection for people and things that went before, I know I'll often stop and think about them. In my life, I love you more. Though I know I'll never lose affection for people and things that went before, I know I'll often stop and think about them. In my life, I love you more.
I remember the first time I ever heard that song was way back in the 1960s. It was performed by the Beatles on their album Rubber Soul. And that album was so different than any other album the Beatles had recorded prior to that time. Long behind them, it seemed, were the simple songs like I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves Me, Yeah, 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 and then Help and A Hard Day's Night. This song was very introspective, written by Paul McCartney. And to think he was only in his mid-20s when he wrote that song. And even when I first heard it in my teens and over the years I've heard it in radio, I never really got the full impact of that song till I was well into my 50s and began to see life a little differently than I had prior to that point. I'm at that age now where you look back over time and you look at the family and friends that are no longer with you. I remember in my childhood having both sets of grandparents and parents and aunts and uncles and cousins, and how many of them are gone now and no longer with us. I think back to when I first got married in the 1970s, just a young guy starting out in radio, and it seemed like I had 1,000,000 years to live my life on this earth. Had plenty of time to accomplish certain things. Just as being online, living in a virtual world has its inherent dangers, also missing out on life because of career and other things has equal amount of dangers and pitfalls and problems. It was about a year or two ago. I woke up early one morning thinking about my dad and thought, man, I'd like to give him a phone call. And then I fully awaked and realized he had passed away 12 years earlier. He was no longer here. A grandmother that I shared so much of my life with, who was a great influence on my life. I conducted her funeral back in the 1990s. A man that I had worked with for over 20-some-odd years in radio died suddenly of a massive heart attack. And I can think of other people that I have known and loved and respected and have been friends with, worked with, that are no longer around. The things we remember in our lives. And even though sometimes thinking about those you have lost can bring about some sad emotion, I know for me and hopefully for you, there's always that smile that comes from remembering the good times that you had with somebody. Live your life as a human being, not as part of a machine. Live your life identifying as an individual, not merely as an occupation. If you live in this virtual world and you live only for your career, it oftentimes has such a sad ending and a life never fully realized. And so many of the blessings and the joys and the happiness, it comes with its share of sorrows and challenges, are so easily missed. If you are somebody in your 20s and 30s and your parents are still alive, cherish the time you have. And don't ignore the opportunity. If you are a parent so into your life and your personal life and career and don't have time for your children, please, for the love of God, don't end up like this Harry Chapin song.
A child arrived just the other day. He came to the world in the usual way, but there were planes to catch and bills to pay. He learned to walk while I was away, and he was talking for I knew it. And as he grew, he'd say, I'm gonna be like you, Dad. You know I'm gonna be like you. And the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon, little boy blue and the man on the moon. When you're coming home, Dad, I don't know when, but we'll get together then. You know we'll have a good time then. My son turned 10 just the other day. He said, thanks for the ball, Dad, come on, let's play. Can you teach me to throw? I said, not today, I got a lot to do. He said, that's okay, and he walked away, but his smile never dimmed. Said, I'm gonna be like him, yeah, you know I'm gonna be like him. And the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon, little boy blue and the man on the moon. When you're coming home, Dad, I don't know when, but we'll get together then. You know we'll have a good time then. Well, he came from college just the other day. So much like a man, I just had to say, son, I'm proud of you. Can you sit for a while? He shook his head and he said with a smile, what I'd really like, Dad, is to borrow the car keys. See you later, can I have them, please? And the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon, little boy blue and the man on the moon. When you're coming home, son, I don't know when, but we'll get together then, Dad. You know we'll have a good time then. I've long since retired, my son's moved away. I called him up just the other day. I said, I'd like to see you if you don't mind. He said, I'd love to, Dad, if I can find the time. You see, my new job's a hassle and the kids are the flu, but it's sure nice talking to you, Dad. It's been sure nice talking to you. And as I hung up the phone, it occurred to me, he'd grown up just like me. My boy was just like me. And the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon, little boy blue and the man on the moon. When you're coming home, son, I don't know when, but we'll get together then, Dad. We're gonna have a good time then.
That song is well over 45 years of age, and its message rings true today just like it did when I first heard it, and maybe many of you first heard that song, Cats in the Cradle and the Silver Moon. Harry Chapin lamenting about how oftentimes parents that are driven to their personal life and success miss the opportunity of their children and find oftentimes too late that they have just broken that relationship forever. I think of young people today that are so allowed to be into their electronics and their devices that are missing out on being a human being and being a member of a family, and they live in this virtual world. Do you see that potential down the road if you're allowing your children to live in a virtual world, that someday when you're wanting that relationship with your adult child, it no longer exists because that virtual world became their reality and you weren't a part of it? This is what we're talking about today on your weekend show. And if you just tuned in, this is your weekend show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann. This is a program, it's a program about life and all the things we go through together. Today on my heart and my mind is differentiating between the real world and a not-so-real virtual world. And how if we define ourselves only by career and our online presence, how much of the joy of life we miss, and how oftentimes we end up using people and not being a part of a community and a family. Today, statistically, more people seem to have deep-seated problems requiring prescription drugs, counseling, and medication because they can't cope with reality. And maybe it's because we've never allowed ourselves to live for a sufficient amount of time in a real world. Maybe you can identify with that, maybe you can't. But something tells me that there's somebody right now that can identify with what I just said. We have spent so much of our life defining ourselves by things to which we really don't control, and allow things to control us, including our virtual world, that we can't cope really in the real world. I looked at how the church, in particular, has failed on so many levels. On one level, you have churches that have abandoned core theology and belief in trying to accommodate the world, to get them into the front door. But once they've compromised, what do they have to give and offer? Nothing. Other churches have dumbed down the faith to simple choruses and entertainment. And once again, we're missing the real world. Many find their church, if they find it at all, simply in a program or an application or an online venue. And they no longer assemble with those that can be a part of their extended family, to be there for them in their time of need. I open this program with a thought that I will use technology to advance a good and positive cause, to use it to educate and learn and communicate. But I struggle, like everybody else, to ensure I don't cross that line where my life is merely defined by an electronic device. As I said, there was that warning out there from one of the developers at Apple that we're coming to that point in 13 to 17 years from now where artificial intelligence will rise to a level to create this incredible virtual world where we live without reality, or so they promise. But you know, even for those that bury themselves in a virtual world, from time to time, they have to leave that world. And each time they come back to the real world, they find it more difficult to endure. We were made to be beings that socialize. We are meant to be a social being interacting with human beings and not electronic devices. Devices like a telephone, a smartphone, a computer, any of these things can be used to connect, but don't make that your life. I know that there are some that are younger that don't even quite understand what I'm saying because they've never really yet lived fully in a real world. Or the real world they lived in was so bad, they used this virtual world to escape. If you don't live in the real world, you're going to miss so much of what life truly has to offer. If you live in a real world, you'll probably end up with a life full of broken relationships and nothing of any depth, nothing of any value. You see, the virtual world can be reset, but it's not real. It never really fulfills. There's always something missing, and there's always something lacking. We can improve our technology, but we cannot improve on the reality of life. This is your weekend show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann. I'm so glad you took some time this weekend to share it with me. This program is heard on international shortwave radio around the world on stations like WRMI, Okeechobee, Florida. We've recently added a new frequency, 9395 kilohertz, and if you're hearing me on 9395, let me know. Or whatever frequency you're listening on, maybe 5850, maybe 7730, or 15770. Or perhaps you're listening on one of the two frequencies of the Voice of Hope, broadcasting in Africa. We are going to continue to grow and expand this program into many places. And of course, you can hear the show on demand online at yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. We also maintain a presence on Facebook, and you can find us on Facebook at Your Weekend Show. Make it one word, Your Weekend Show, one word, and search for us on Facebook. And if you get a chance, like us and let us know what you think about the program. Every week, it's my prayer to come before this microphone and share something of value and help to you. I think of homes that are broken apart. I think of people that have gone through loss of a job, loss of a spouse, loss of something of value. And life can be difficult, but life can, if you allow it, if you submit yourself under the lordship of Jesus Christ, life can have a greater value than you could have ever anticipated. I pray today with every ounce of my being that you will find the real things of real and lasting, eternally lasting things of value in your life. Until next week at this same time, this is Bob Biermann wishing God's greatest blessings upon you.
It's Your Weekend Show with Bob Biermann.